Hello and welcome to Modifications for Teachers of English Learners. My name is Kristen Adams and I'm a staff development facilitator at the Carbon-Lehigh Intermediate Unit. And joining us today is Kathy. Welcome, Kathy.
Hi, welcome. Thanks for having me.
She brings a host of experience as an ESL teacher, and our goal today is to take a look at modifications and accommodations for ELSE and provide our English learners access to the content through these modifications.
So we're going to start with a few assessment modifications. Some of these will be reminders and some of them may be new to you. The first one, thanks Kristen, the first one is one that I would often get asked by teachers when I was an ESL teacher is, how can I modify some of my handouts and my worksheets and things? So this is just a quick way to take the student's paper and do some underlining and highlighting. So highlight some clues, underline parts that you think will help them. It's almost like taking it and turning it into boldface. So don't be afraid to mark up your students' work. And you can do this electronically as well, using highlighting tools and underlining. So that's just a really quick, simple example. And there you can see what it looks like.
Another way that you can make modifications, and you can do these on the spot, is by minimizing choices. As you can see in number 13, when you use an expression such as all of the above, this can be confusing for some of our low-level ELSE. So by eliminating that option, you're allowing students to pick one of them and not get overwhelmed with all of the choices. You can do the same thing when it comes to number 14. As you see, we eliminated one answer D. And in 15, we provided choices that would make sense so that they can pick the appropriate one. We want to allow our students to have success. And by doing these things and making the accommodations and modifications by minimizing choices, it allows the students to have equal access to the curriculum and allows them to identify the correct answer without misleading them with all of these extra choices.
Right, so very similarly, word banks. Most teachers use word banks in some capacity, and whether it's assessment or review, and this would be the same with matching. Try to eliminate the extra words. Try not to put extra words in for the English learners because it's fatiguing, it's confusing. So just as Kristen said in the last example, minimizing choices, we're not trying to make it easier. We're trying to not have them fatigue. It's very difficult to read so much in a second language, and this lets them concentrate more on the content rather than reading all those extraneous pieces. So just cross out some words for your ELs depending on their level, or don't put them in at all.
So those talked about how to eliminate some of the choices. Another thing that we want to consider is when we're using a writing prompt, setting them up for success. And whether you're using an essay or a short response, using sentence stems or question stems allows students to be able to answer them. So for example, if the teacher prompt was, do you agree or disagree? So after giving that question stem, you can now give them the sentence stem and allow them to pick one of those. Do they agree? Yes, I agree. No, I don't. Yes, I agree that blank because blank. So we're allowing students to have a structure in order to answer, and that is helping our students and allowing for us to modify it and check for understanding at the same time. This is a great example of how you can use the close technique. You could have even a sentence written for them and then a word or two that they can put in or add to that sentence. Those are all ways to help with writing prompts and allow for students to answer the question, but in a way that helps scaffold them to guide them in the right direction in order to answer.
And another pretty basic thing is just when you're making your plans, when you're writing your plans, reviewing what you're going to teach, Take a look at the directions you're giving students, the written directions, and just ask yourself if there's a way you could modify that to make it less language, less confusing. So for example, you can see on your screen, the directions for the students might say, carefully read each sentence below and determine if it's a noun or determine its noun and verb, then underline the noun once and the verb twice. So even as a competent reader, I'm going to read that a couple of times to make sure I'm doing it right. But an easier way to say that for an English learner at a lower level would be read each sentence, put one line under the noun, put two lines under the verb. Much more clean and less confusing. So as you're planning, always take a look at where you think your ELs might stumble and simplify it. Another, oops, is this me, Kristen? I can't remember.
Yes,
That
you're
is
good.
okay. Another one is, excuse me, there's a lot of great review information in textbooks. And if your students are using the textbook, encourage them either with you or on their own or with a partner to review the materials, the review materials that are in the textbook. That's a great quick review. Usually you may not have to make much modification to the language of it, but take advantage of that. Get them used to using those pieces for review so they can check for their own understanding.
When it comes to assessments, let's take a look at some of the accommodations that you can use for your ELs. These accommodations could be beneficial for other students in your classroom as well. So start to think through some of the needs of your classroom and then think of some ways that you can set your students up for success. For example, you could allow for oral responses. Instead of writing it down, they could tell it to you or you could scribe it for them. You could allow extra time on parts of the assignment to allow them to process the information. You could allow translation tools. You could use Google Translate or another device to allow for students to type in words that they might not know in English and they can make sure that it's translated so they can use it. And you could work one-on-one with a student. Those are a few assessment accommodations that you can consider.
Let's talk about note-taking for a moment because this is, especially important at the secondary level. So sometimes teachers give all students, completed notes ahead of time, and other times they expect students to take their own notes, and some, hybrid in between. Sometimes they're partial notes. When you're using or asking students to use note-taking, you may want to make sure that your ELs are given notes in advance, that they're complete, that they don't have to write them. Trying to listen to a teacher teach and at the same time record the important parts is really challenging, especially for an EL. So give them either complete or partially complete notes in advance that they might be able to look over. If there's textbook pages that coordinate to what the notes are, give those textbook pages. So in the notes that you're creating, say refer to textbook pages, whatever, or go to pages, whatever. That's a great support. And finally, and I've seen this unfortunately too often, where English learners are using really poor notes uh, to review for their assessment. So if it's a higher level EL and they are creating their own notes as the rest of the students are, you might want to make sure to take a look at their notes before any studying time for assessment to make sure that their notes are accurate and on point. And then I'm going to go back to textbook again, as we just talked about the review sections of textbook. If you are, especially again, secondary teachers, if you expect students to use a textbook, quite frequently, spend some time at the beginning of the semester walking them through the textbook. This helps all students, but especially your English learners. Make sure that you point out, take kids to the index. This is the index. This is where you can look, things up that you might be looking for specifically. This is the table of content. This is the glossary. You might see that in this textbook, words that are in red are found in the glossary. This is the organization of the textbook. Every unit or every chapter is organized in a similar way, and that will help you move through it if you understand the organization of it. Every unit has a summary. Be sure to look at the summary. Every photograph or graph or chart has a caption. Those are an important part of the information. So I really strongly suggest that a class period is used to get familiar with the textbook if it's going to be an ongoing piece in that class. The last thing that I'm going to talk about, I think, is student projects. When I was an ESL teacher, I was in a middle school, and student projects really ramped up at that level. And so a project might last a whole marking period, or it might last several weeks. Sometimes projects were done in small groups. Sometimes they were assigned individually. But when you assign student projects, really, again, when you're planning it, take a look through the eyes of an English learner. So if it's a small group, who are you going to group your English learner with? If it's individual, how are you going to make sure that that student understands all of the directions? And really, that's often going to be something you do one-on-one, or make sure another student does. Chunk the project steps, which you probably already do, but if you don't, if it's a 3-week project, your you should have that broken down by writing on their assignment, by writing on the project description, this is piece A, or this is part 1. I want to see it when you're done with this section. So make it into more manageable steps. Always provide examples. What's the end goal here? What's an example or two of what it could look like? And you may have to provide extra time, extend the deadline. One thing that's not here that I also want to add is, especially for our 6th graders, our 7th graders, you might want to make sure that the parent, if it's a long-term project, that the parent understands the assignment. So that may mean having someone translate some basic directions for you, or making a call to the parent just to assure them. I've seen parents really, English learner parents really stress over these long-term projects because they're not really sure what to do. And in their culture, it might be acceptable for them to almost do the whole thing for the student. So make sure that parents understand what their responsibility is in the project and what's expected of their child rather.
So those are excellent examples when it comes to projects and assessments. Just a few things to wrap up. When it comes to recordings, there's many things you can do to help our elves in terms of allowing them to hear the language. So you can use books on tape and recordings that accompany the content reading. And you can make your own recordings of books and content. I know in our digital world that we've been in, you can create YouTube videos and all kinds of things to allow students to have access to the content. Here's a way below if you use Vocaroo. Vocaroo is free and it's online, and I highly recommend using it if you need to record something, or if you want your students to record something back. One of the ways that you could do this is you could have the directions for one of the assignments recorded. So they could click on the directions that you've pre-recorded, and you can insert that anywhere. You can insert that in your Google Classroom, or you could insert that in the actual presentation or link that you wanted them to do that. You can also, if you think about what Kathy was talking about, giving examples, you can do it auto. You could put the example in there of either a short video clip or just your audio explaining how to complete the project. So when you're taping, remember a few things. Speak slowly and clearly, and try to diminish any background noises. That way your students can focus on what you're saying. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you learned some quick tips. Continue to use all of your resources and make some accommodations and modifications. A lot of them can happen right on the fly. So we hope that you can take something back to the classroom with you. Feel free to check out any of our ESL updates and resources by clicking on the link below. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at adamc@cliu.org.